smarter impact is about going beyond ourselves, our work, and our communities. It's about enabling better choices that make a difference in people's lives. And recognizing that everything is connected. To make a smarter impact, we must be knowledge-led, human-centric, and optimistic. Ready to make a smarter impact? Talk with our team or visit our website to learn how.
Good morning. We live in interesting times. I wish we could be doing this face-to-face, but hopefully that's going to happen in 2021. In the meantime, let's make the best of the situation where we are forced to talk to you long distance. I want to introduce my colleague, Roni, who's actually joining us from Israel today. She'll actually be in the United States when the conference is on. So hopefully if there's some Q&A, live Q&A, we can jump in and talk to you together. So the topic today is transforming education by design. And before we begin, I'd just like to do some quick introductions. My name is Prakash, and I already introduced Roni. We work with Education Design International. I'm the founding president and CEO of that company. Essentially, EDI came into being because of my experience with New York City, which was, I'm just going to start my timing here, which essentially was something that taught me everything about how not to do schools. We've actually built 100 new schools in New York City, which basically were obsolete on the day they opened. And to make a long story short, we started a company to make education the centerpiece of the school building movement. And I'm happy to report that over the last 20 years, we've done work in 52 countries. I would hope that each and every one of those schools that we worked on, and talk about literally hundreds of them, are all innovative in one way or the other, always driven by education first. With that, I'm going to move on.
So I'll start with the first question, Prakash, for you. In spite of all its problems, schools and universities continue to educate hundreds of millions of people all around the world. And the question is, beyond COVID, what is so different today to imagine that education needs a revolutionary change?
Well, the answer to that question is in the slide. The revolutionary change that we're talking about in education is already happening in every other industry, particularly artificial intelligence. So the fourth industrial revolution is right here. We are in the thick of it. We're in the middle of it. And the difference between this and the previous revolutions is that this one is evolving exponentially. And so this is going to have a tremendous impact on education at all levels. And we are going to see that. So the question simply is, are we going to evolve? Actually, I would say more than evolve. Are we going to change or become obsolete? So that's really our two options. So it doesn't mean that if the educational systems, what we know as education institutions, they don't change, then learning is simply going to escape the boundaries of a school building and go elsewhere. The schools might continue to function, but their relevance is going to become less and less and less over time. So let me just talk a little bit about what that means. What we're talking about is that right now, the entire education model is hierarchical, and we'll talk more about that soon. But outside of schooling, we have something called the open network, where we are connecting with people, resources, and information as needed when needed. And so we really are looking to make a transformation from the hierarchical to the open network model.
So we understand the need of a network-based model, but don't we already have that? I mean, don't most children already use the internet for learning?
They do, but we're going beyond the internet. We're looking essentially at the institutional model in which students are, I would even use the word trapped. And in fact, many adults and many schools and school systems themselves, I believe, are trapped. This is actually a model that Professor Richard Elmore came up with. And for those of you who are interested in pursuing this further, I strongly recommend a course. It's called Leaders of Learning. It's a Harvard edX course in which these concepts are discussed in greater detail. So basically, if you look at this, there's 4 quadrants here. The first quadrant is called hierarchical individual. And that basically means that there's a hierarchy of people, the leaders of education, who are providing information for individual students to succeed according to their definition of success. So every student has to jump, in other words, through the same hoops in order to go from grade to grade and eventually graduate from high school, and the system continues in college as well. So essentially, the individual is completely at the mercy of the hierarchy and has to comply with all the requirements of the hierarchy in order to be considered successful in education. The second model is a hierarchical collective. Here, the only difference is that it's still a hierarchy. Individual students are still kind of taking their marching orders from the hierarchy, but here there's a collective goal. In other words, the hierarchy is telling us, look, education is not just about you. It's about improving the world, making the world a better place. And so there's a collective responsibility for all individuals to make learning better and the world better for everybody. Now, the distributed individual model on the top right says that, look, we acknowledge the reality of the fourth industrial revolution. We understand that information and resources are freely available. It makes no sense for us to kind of be the little control point where we decide what you learn and how you learn and where you learn. So essentially, our job as adults is to give you access to this amazing, amazing treasure trove of knowledge and information. And you guys get to decide what to learn, when to learn, where to learn from. And our job is to provide you with the wisdom to help you sort through all that billions and billions of bits of information that's out there. The distributed collective basically is blurring the lines between teacher and student. Essentially, it's a collection of people that come together to share common interests. So it would be something like a chess club or a book club, where people are getting together. They bring their own expertise to the table, but at the same time, they're also learning from everybody else around them. So these four modes of learning are what are available. Unfortunately, schools tend to be trapped in the top left quadrant, which is hierarchical individual. So I guess the question from here would be to Roni. Now that I've told you about all this, the question then becomes, well, what is learning? I mean, how do we know what learning is? And even if we did want to change, what would that change actually look like?
Well, the one thing I think we need to keep in mind is that teaching and learning are not the same. And when we talk about learning, we are referring to two types of models, the teacher-centered and the student-centered. Next, please. So that's an example for the teacher-centered model, where the teacher is basically in charge. Next. And the whole focus is around the teacher. The teacher is in charge. It's about her needs and less about the students. Next, the student-centered learning is putting the student in the center, meaning that students have a voice, they are in charge, they are leading the learning, and it's theirs. Next, if you look at these pictures, you can see that children do not need us to tell them how to learn. And if you notice the title talks about student-directed learning, not just student-centered learning. And that's a slight different, because in this room, we do not know if the teacher gave an instruction that the students are currently following, or do they have agency to pick their own way of learning, do what they would like to do, focus on what they would like to learn. And basically what we can see is that different students are doing different types of learning in this room. So it can be either student-directed learning or student-centered learning. Next. When we talk about student-centered learning, there are four major principles. The first one is personalized learning. It speaks for itself. Every child is different, and we would like to treat them as individuals, which is very hard to do, having a group of 20 or 25 students with a teacher locked in a classroom most of the time. Competency-based education means that we will not move on until each and every student has mastered whatever it is that we are learning. Anytime, anywhere learning has to do with what Prakash showed earlier. He was talking about the net model, and learning is everywhere. It has basically already escaped the boundaries of schools, and we need to acknowledge that. Student-owned learning means that students has to be partners. They cannot just be told what to do and stay at the bottom of the hierarchy. Next. Our latest book, Learning by Design, is based on the assumption that learning is a very natural activity. We are all born with natural curiosity. We are all capable of learning on our own, and learning is a byproduct of our life. So whether it's an everyday life activities that we're doing, we're learning. Play is also a kind of learning, and it's very natural, especially for kids. And if you saw a kid engaged with somebody, of course, that learning is part of that, and eventually create. So what we're saying is less is more. Less teaching, more learning in a more natural way. Next.
So I think that's pretty obvious from what you're saying, that learning is really a byproduct of the things that we do. There have to be some ramifications for learning spaces. And since the vast majority of learning spaces that we have have been built 30, 40, even 100 years ago, what happens to those spaces, and what are the actual implications for learning spaces?
So that's a typical cells and bells schools. We call it cells and bells because teachers and students walk into one of these cells that we like to call classroom at the beginning of the day, and then the bell goes off and the students are moving from one cell to another identical cell, doing more or less the same kind of learning, which is mostly frontal teaching. Next. I think you'd be very familiar with this picture. You can see it all around the world. I come from Israel. It looks the same here as anywhere else. Next. Sometimes a little bit nicer if we have large windows that bringing in daylight. Next. And you can see that not all students are sitting in rows in this classroom. In this particular classroom, there's a group sitting in the middle of the room, but still the teacher is in charge. It's still a teacher-centered learning model. What we're talking about is a change of paradigm. And by the way, next, this model is very, very old. It's actually over 100 years old. It started around 1875 and hasn't changed much until this very day. So Prakash, I'd like to ask you, are there any universal design principles that you could recommend to school designers?
Sure. There are, in fact, principles that apply across schools, across countries, across cultures as well. So let's look at 4 of them. For one thing, I think the idea of being welcoming, and welcoming doesn't just apply to the people who are in the school, but also the school as a welcoming element in the community. So it starts at the community level and then, of course, gets down to the level of the school. So for students, schools have to feel safe and nurturing. It has to be versatile, meaning that since we don't know what particular mode of learning a student might be at any given time, we want the spaces to be agile and for students to have that opportunity to personalize their own learning. It has to support multiple modalities of learning. There are many, many different ways of learning. Schools tend to prioritize the lecture and presentation form, and we want to be able to prioritize many, many different forms of learning, from independent study, collaboration, research, project-based learning, and on and on. And finally, the spaces need to send positive messages. A good example would be a hallway with lockers. I mean, it's a familiar sight, but also not a healthy one. That's where a lot of the antisocial behaviors happen. Well, what if you got rid of hallways? What if you didn't have lockers in the way that they are and change the paradigm to a different one? And Ronnie will be talking a little bit about learning communities, and it'll explain further why the positive messages thing is so important. So here, for example, is a public school that we designed in Colorado. And you can see the entrance, we call it a family room. And because essentially when you enter the school, you need to be feeling welcomed. So this is not only for the visitors, but also for the students. And behind it is a curiosity center where students get to pick and choose what they learn, how they learn. And all around the curiosity center are spaces where they can actually implement their ideas. They can build things, they can design things. So this is kind of what we mean by when we talk about welcoming. If you talk about agile, you're talking about spaces in which multiple modes of ways of learning can be, where students can kind of self-select what they do, when they do, and how they do it. And the Thornburg modalities gets to the idea of multiple learning modalities. We talk about the campfire, which is the traditional teacher-centered model, where teachers are lecturing, which is not a bad thing. We're not saying lectures are bad. Direct instruction is fine, as long as it is part of a bigger picture. The second aspect is watering hole, which is where you learn from each other. Children should have an opportunity to do cooperative learning, peer tutoring, and things like that. And cave is when you learn by yourself, because you have to internalize and synthesize the things that you learned at the watering hole and at the campfire. And life is when you actually get to try it out. So what we are saying is that for the cycle of learning to be complete, we need students to experience all four modalities of learning. Right now, schools are heavily oriented toward the campfire mode of learning. So here, for example, would be what a positive messages image might be. And you can see here, there's a variety of furniture. Students can pick and choose the size of groupings. They can work independently. They can work in a larger or smaller group. There's access to nature. There's a cafe small at the end of the this room here, where students can go and get some refreshments. So this is what we mean by spaces sending positive messages. So Roni, based upon what I just said, what would be the alternative then to the cells and bells? And especially when you're talking about existing schools, what happens? I mean, where do you go? How do you translate all the stuff that I just told you and change the cells and bells model?
So basically, the way we look at it is a hardware and a software. If you look at this slide, you'll see the hardware on the top of the slide. And if you look at the top left, that's actually the hardware of the cells and bells model that I showed before. We see the same kind of cells, the repetitive cell and the corridor. And underneath, we see the software. So we would like to at least allow the black line to shift from the left side to the right side. If we really want a change of paradigm, then the building should not be limiting the education. It shouldn't be limiting the practice. So if you look on the right side of the slide, on the top right, that's a change of hardware. And it's a slight change. We're just taking off this small wall here between the classrooms, and we're making it to what we are calling a learning suite. That allows teachers to start collaborating and to start working as a team. It allows the change of the pedagogy, and basically it's a step towards changing the paradigm. Next. So this is what we call a learning community. And again, we're talking hardware and software. On the left side, we see the hardware, which is basically the physical environment, the learning space. And you can see on the top left, the learning suite that we've seen before, but around that, there are a whole bunch of different spaces allowing different kinds of learning activities to take place. We have the commons in the middle. We have the small group room for a quiet learning of a small group, the wet and messy area for whatever hands-on work we would like students to be doing, the media bar, and in the middle of all this, we have the teacher collaboration suite, which allows the teacher to do their work while the students are working independently on whatever it is they're doing. And the last thing is the very strong connection between indoors and outdoors, which is allowing students to also break out and to spread to the outdoors area and enjoy learning in the open air. If you look on the right side of the slide, you will see the software that we were talking about earlier. And you can see that the black line has moved from the left side to the right side. It doesn't mean that teachers has to be working as a team the whole time, but now that option is possible, something that we could not do before when we were looking at the cells and bells model. The pedagogy can change, the curriculum can change. We can have a learning community, which is basically allowing the full paradigm change that I mentioned earlier. Next. So that's what a learning community might look like. You can see it used to be a classroom, and now the wall between the two classrooms is open. Students can be directed by the teachers, but they have agency to move around and do whatever it is that they want to do around this space. Next. They can sit around, work on the computers independently or doing some group work. They can look outside on the greenery, a thing which is improving our cognitive functioning. Next. Or it can look like this. This is a very big commons that is connected to the learning studios. You can see on the right side of the picture, or to conference rooms or small group rooms, or even to a media lab. Prakash, you wanted to especially introduce this project, right?
Well, yeah, this is the A4LE audience, so they're probably familiar. This is the McConnell Award winners, the STEAM, Greenville STEAM School in South Carolina. It was actually done in collaboration with Clemson University and BMW. Other industries are also partnering with the school.
Next. And when Prakash was talking earlier about a welcoming space, that's one of the pictures I have in mind, a space which is also allowing multidisciplinary learning of multiple creativity studies. And I think by that we're going to move on next. And Prakash, the next question I would like to ask you is, what is the first thing that we can do to demonstrate to schools, that these ideas actually work?
Well, I think I'll talk a little bit about pathfinders here. And the reason is very simple, because change, as we know, is exceptionally difficult, particularly in the world of education, where there's this fear that people have that we are experimenting with children. So people want to see what is familiar, and things that are not familiar are also kind of scary. Because ultimately, we don't want to do anything that might harm children's future. So what happens is that changes tend to be much more modest in scale. They're incremental changes and not really paradigm changes. So what we've discovered is that over time, that schools are much better off trying to do things on a smaller scale, and we call them pathfinder projects, and then measure the outcomes from that smaller space and use it as a innovation lab, so to speak. And then things that work can be scaled up. So I'll give you a couple of specific examples to tell you what I'm talking about. So first one is actually Horace Greeley High School in Chappaqua, New York, and we created an iLab there. And basically the iLab took an existing building and in New York City, not far from New York City, I mean, and the classrooms here look very typical. In fact, there's a picture of this room, very same room, I think from 30 or 40 years ago, and it looked almost identical to this image. And so, and by the way, this is one of the highest performing high schools in the country. So academically, the school was doing well, but there's a number of soft skills, obviously, that students are not getting, and Rodi touched upon all of that by sitting in a classroom as opposed to being in a learning community. So we created this iLab, which is essentially a learning community. We took 3 classrooms and a hallway and converted it into this innovation lab. And as you can see, basically what we did is we changed the furniture, we changed the finishes, and we also kept some of the existing structure because structurally we didn't want to do much and spend a lot of money on structural changes. So the simple sort of way to describe this innovation lab is to say that we took 3 classrooms in which you could do the campfire mode of learning, and we created a place in which all 4 of Thornburg's modalities, campfire, cave, watering hole, and life can all happen here. So the spaces are designed for a truly independent, personalized model, but at the same time, very, very student-centered and student-directed as well. So again, here are some images from there. And as you look through these images, as I flash through them, take a quick look at them and imagine in your mind how this kind of a learning might look like if it were in a classroom. And for the most part, the answer would be, it wouldn't be possible. It wouldn't be possible to do the kinds of teaching and learning that you see in these spaces. And it's the exact same space, mind you. It's the same 3 classrooms and hallway. We haven't changed anything beyond that. So there could be a cafe, which can convert to a more formal learning space, student presentations, and you can see on the other side of the wall, other activities are happening. Acoustics are obviously very important. And we also have closed rooms where small groups can get together and technology can be part of that learning. Again, the images sort of speak for themselves: independent work, technology work, art. Most important thing is the kind of relationship that teachers and students can have in this format, which would have been very, very difficult to do if a teacher's there with 25 or 30 students in a classroom. Now, a similar case study, this is Academy of the Holy Names, which is a very, very conservative Catholic school, which has a 100-year history of success. So they were very nervous about any significant change. So again, we recommended to them, why not start with an innovation lab? And since they're a 2-device school, every student has an iPad as well as a MacBook. They basically were prepared to give up these 2 computer labs. So we had computer lab A and computer lab B. And over the course of a summer, we converted this into a student-centered model of learning, an innovation lab. And as you can see here, the traditional model, the teachers at the front of the room, and this is definitely old paradigm. So we basically took the wall out between the 2 rooms and created a series of different areas, regions. And this is what the end product looked like after a few weeks of work over the summer. And you can see we went from a very teacher-directed, teacher-centered model to a student-centered model. And these images speak for themselves. The students you see here were actually in this space for the first time ever. And they were completely comfortable. They're completely taken over the space. So the idea that this is a difficult transition for students is not true. It might be a little bit more difficult for the teachers, but for students, this kind of movement is exceptionally easy. And you can see direct instruction happens, but in much smaller measure. A teacher pulls a little whiteboard, gives a quick instruction, and then the room goes back to being student-centered and student-directed. So the school was so comfortable with the changes that happened that we looked at the rest of that middle school and we started to make changes. So here, for example, is a hallway that we were dealing with that was converted to a space like this. So as you can see, a far more functional and aesthetically beautiful space, still giving students an opportunity to have individual student storage. This is what the old library looked like, which was now converted to a learning community. And that's what that same space looks like now. This is another image of that same library, which is now again a learning community. So you can see that it's a space in which teachers and students can teach and learn with the kind of variety that would not have been possible had they been in the classroom. Now, interestingly, there's a classroom right just into it where the students could be, but the teacher has chosen not to be in that classroom. So,
okay, Prakash.
Yeah.
So you started this talk by saying we live in very interesting times. And I would like to ask you, in the end, what will be the legacy of COVID on education, and how can we make sure that some real lasting good comes from this terrible crisis that we're all experiencing at the moment?
Yeah, that's a great question, Rodney. And I really do hope that we understand that, I mean, we've been doing this now for 20 years. We've always realized that education in its current format is broken. And it has nothing to do with COVID. But I think COVID may have woken people up to the reality that we cannot do the education the old way, if only because we're physically not able to do it, right? But what I'm saying is that just because we can do it doesn't mean we need to go back to it. So for one thing, as you can see in purple, the physical school has been repurposed in the way that I'm talking about. So that's a critical, important thing because, Roni, you pointed out quite clearly that the hardware and software are completely connected. So we can talk till we're blue in the face, but the reality is that if schools look like a Cells and Bell school, then you're only going to be able to do a traditional teacher-centered model of education. So all the great talk about personalization and differentiation makes no difference if you're trapping children and teachers in that old paradigm. So for one thing, that has to change. Now, all the other boxes that you see here, these are all the opportunities for learning that schools can tap into. And the key difference, of course, is that when students are not in the physical school, it shouldn't be a duplication of what happens in the school. Unfortunately, now with the pandemic, many of the children are going home and they're trying to duplicate the school at home, which is why it's failing. I mean, you have the teachers in a Zoom call and everybody's sitting there waiting for the instruction. We don't have to have synchronous. We can have asynchronous learning happening. We can have all of these other ways in which the online world can be brought and made it a partner rather than being a competitor to schools. The online world can become a partner. my way of looking at it is that a computer is not the place for learning necessarily. The computer is a window into the world of learning. So, for example, a computer might be the place that you learn how to garden. It could be a place where you learn how to play the guitar. It could be a place where you to connect with people in distant lands. So it's an entry point, but it's not the end result of what learning should look like. So going back to the whole transformation thing, over these 20 years, one of the things we've learned is that transformation is exceptionally difficult. And the reason for that is because the learning spaces we already talked about, we saw how they need to be changed. But it's not enough just to change learning spaces. There has to be corresponding change in the curriculum. And then we also have to talk about a schedule. I mean, we have to get rid of the 45-minute bells and on and on. So it's a domino effect where when you start messing with classrooms, you essentially have to step back and say, wow, I need to change the whole system, which is why the Pathfinders are a great way of doing this, because you're doing it at a small scale. You can then replicate it, the successful model, in a more comfortable way, in a way that was accepted. So of course, you can see professional development, absolutely critical, because teachers need to know how to go from a single model where they're teaching on their own to a model where they're working as part of a team. It's a completely different model. And then governance, operations, and the community, all of them have to be partners. And so this is a systemic change that we're talking about, which is very different from the incremental changes in education that have happened over the last 30, 40, 50 years. So from our perspective, we look at this as a process, right? I mean, part of the reason why education doesn't work as well as it should is because we're focused on outcomes. And so when you focus on outcomes, we tend to value the things that we can measure instead of measuring the things that we value. So what do we really value? We value all those soft skills that we were talking about: collaboration, creativity, problem solving, and yet that's not what we are measuring. So the problem is that those kinds of skills are much longer term. You have to be engaged in a long-term process of problem solving, because before you can be called a problem solver, you have to be constantly given creative assignments before you can be called creative, and on and on. So our goal is to try to measure process and not just outcomes. If you do all the right things, like a marathon runner, if you do all the right things, eventually you'll become a marathon runner. But you're not going to wake up one day and suddenly magically find yourself to become a marathon runner. It takes effort, it takes patience. And that's what I think schools should measure. So assessment becomes an absolutely critical part of the equation. So in that regard, we've actually designed a couple of tools, several tools, as a matter of fact. I'm demonstrating one here, which is where every school, as we design it, is looked at as a map of activities and functions. So as we go in there, you see these pins that we drop in, just like in a Google map. You drop these pins in, and under the pin is all the information about that particular space, all the qualities of that space. So as a teacher, when you're designing a lesson plan, you know exactly the educational and qualities of these spaces, and you can design lessons so that a variety of modalities of learning are incorporated into that, so the lesson becomes rich. It's delivering not only the hard skills, but it's also delivering the soft skills for students. And then what happens is when the school is built and operating, this app is now available for students and teachers. So over the course of a week, a month, 6 weeks, a year, you are able to actually assess what is actually happening in these spaces. Are we actually realizing what we set out to the goals that we set out with? Are students actually doing student-centered learning? Are they actually doing research? Are they actually doing collaboration? So it might be shocking for a school to say, wow, we designed all these amazing spaces, and guess what? 60% of the time, teachers are still doing direct instruction. This app will tell you that, because it is a real-time measure, formative assessments that are happening with the space being done by the occupants of the space and not by some external third party. So I'd love to explain more about this app to you. It's hard to do that in the course of a meeting like this. So those of you who want to learn more about these apps, we are happy to explain it to you. Just contact us at your convenience.
Prakash, could you go back for a second?
Yeah.
I just want to also note that it's a very efficient tool, both to control time and space management, and also to evaluate how good the spaces is designed. Because if some of these rooms are not being used enough, or some of them are being overused, it can also be a tool to change over time. And a good design is a design that allows the space to change according to the changing needs of the school and this learning community.
Yeah, and as Roni was saying, we can measure the capacity. We obviously know the capacity of schools, but we can also measure the utilization, not only of the school as a whole, but we can measure the utilization of different spaces. So you might have spent a lot of money, for example, on a nice cafe, but you can say, wow, it's only being utilized 20% of the time. And that's an information for teachers to say, well, let's go out and take advantage of that space that really doesn't seem to be used to its full potential. So there's a lot of ancillary benefits from an app like this, which, by the way, I don't think anybody else in the world has other than us, because we've realized it's a missing piece of the equation. So I think that when you asked me, Roni, about the impacts, I think outdoor learning is something that could be a legacy of the COVID crisis. So maybe you want to talk briefly about outdoor learning?
I'll be happy to. So everything I'm going to talk about and show in the next few slides, you can find in our latest white paper, Outdoor Learning, which is available on Amazon, but we would also be very happy to share the electronic copy with any of you that are interested. Next.
By the way, this is a publication of the Association for Learning Environments, and you can get the book free at their website as well. And we are happy to send you email copies.
So we're looking at a playground, and basically this is how a playground looks when adults are deciding for the children how they should play. Next. As opposed to this picture where the children get to choose how, where, and whom with they would like to play. Of course, this is encouraging a lot more creativity and opens up a lot more options. Next. Playing is a very creative activity, so why not use outdoor environment for games like chess? Next. And it can also be an extension of a science lab. We can actually explore fieldwork opportunities, which are very, they're available at a natural environment. Sorry, yes. Next. Vegetable garden, which can be small scale or a larger scale. It has lots of benefits. Kids are taking part in a process, which is a long-term process, meaning that they will not see the results and they will not be rewarded immediately. They plant these plants, they need to water them, they need to watch them and take care of them for a long, long time, and follow the process until they will see the results. A community garden is also an option. Next. Planting a tree is even a longer term process, and it has its own benefits, like enjoying the fruits at the end of the process. Next. And of course, treating animals has its obvious benefits. It's a lot of fun, and kids usually naturally connect with animals, and on the way they treat each other better as well. Next. And this is a case study of a farm, belongs to Ballarat School in Victoria, Australia. The farm is actually 8 kilometers away from school, and the fourth graders spend the whole year in this farm studying, researching, and doing farm work. Why not? Next. Weather is not an excuse for staying in. What we like to keep in mind is that there's no bad weather, there's only bad clothing. So even in the most extreme climates, if kids are dressed properly, they can spend a daily amount of time outdoors, which is very healthy for them, of course. Next. The important thing to keep in mind when it comes to outdoor learning is that we don't just want to copy the classroom outside. We would like to explore and to take advantage of what the outdoor environment has to offer. And that's a different kind of learning, different content, different modalities. Next. If you look on this green amphitheater, for example, just imagine all the different things you can do here as opposed to being in a classroom. Next. A tree house, and this is an example from one of our schools in Texas. It's called Anna Frank Inspire Academy, right, Prakash?
Yes.
And was designed by
Pete Nelson. I think he's the treehouse master. He has a whole series on the Animal Planet. So we managed to grab him before he became famous, and so he built this treehouse for us,
which brings a lot of joy to the students of this school. Next. This is a good example for an indoor-outdoor connection, a transformation space, if you like. The kids can spend time outdoors doing actual learning, but still have a very good connection, a visual connection with the indoors. So the teachers can actually, the teacher doesn't have to be there in person. She can actually spot them, and it's an extension of the indoors learning community. Next. Low-hanging fruit could be spaces like underneath the building that can easily be turned into a nice spaces like these. Next. Why not eat outside? If the climate allows that, nice weather, nice day, let's just sit outside and eat. Next. And last thing is, you know, if we cannot go outside to the outdoors, we can bring the greenery inside. So if climate is not allowing that, then we can definitely bring in greenery inside the building. I think that was the last slide about outdoor learning. I'll end by saying that it's very relevant these days with the COVID crisis, but there's no reason why not treat outdoors environment as part of a learning environment, even after, in the future, after COVID crisis is actually gone. And by that, Prakash.
Yeah. So basically, I think this is a good kind of slide to conclude what we were talking about. It says here, when the phone was tied with the wire, humans were free. And now that the phone is basically free, humans are tied to the phone. And the outdoor learning is a good place for us to sort of take stock of how we can disconnect from the phone. But we don't want to limit this only to the outdoors. What we are talking about, our entire presentation has been about providing opportunities for students not to feel sort of beholden to their devices and reconnect people with each other. You know, we talked about learning communities as a way for human beings to connect with other human beings, because classrooms are certainly not good places to do that. And so the addiction to the phone is partly because we don't provide sufficient opportunities for students to be with other human beings. You know, outdoors is an amazing place for that, but so can indoors. The learning community is a perfect place where students can practice those soft skills of collaboration, independent study if necessary, but also social and emotional development is a perfect opportunity to do that in those kinds of spaces. And I think finally, there's a whole movement around the world of it's called slow learning. And essentially what that is the idea that just because the world is moving at breakneck speed, there's no reason why we should be moving at breakneck speed. In other words, as human beings, we have some innate needs which are not necessarily in sync with the absolute rapid pace of the world. And so we can be successful by focusing on our adaptability and our innate strength and our creativity. Those skills will stand by us no matter how the world changes. So rather than be so focused on content and trying to master everything that's in a textbook, I think we should be focused more on being peaceful and sort of having some quiet space in our minds so that we can, in fact, respond in a creative way to the inevitable changes that we're going to be faced with. With that, I want to just say that this is our contact information. You can contact either Roni or me, and we are more than happy to have a continued conversation. As far as our work is concerned, architects listening to this, we'd love to partner with you. In fact, every single project that we've done, we've partnered with local architects. And it's an amazing thing when we can learn from you. Hopefully you learn from us. And the same thing as if you're an educator, we hope that you will think about talking to us, whether it's do work or just learn more about all the stuff that we're talking about. We'd love to share this information with you. So with that, I think I'm going to stop here and want to thank all of you for the patience to listen to us, and hopefully we'll be running into each other personally in the not too distant future. Roni?
I just want to add that on our teams, we have educators as well as architects and designers. And our process always starts with thinking about the educational philosophy behind the design. This is the basis for our design. So we would love to get to know whether it's schools or, like you said, educators or architects. We're always happy to collaborate and to, like you said, get to know new ideas. Maybe we should end with the note that, again, learning is a very, very natural activity that we all do and we're all born with. And every child that is born into this world is actually a whole small universe. And when we're putting them through our educational system, what we need to keep in mind is that we do not want to hurt that. We do not want to hurt their natural curiosity. We do not want to limit those, not by the building, not by the philosophy. So the concept of learning communities are to allow all that to evolve naturally as much as possible.
Okay, thank you.